Welcome to the OPC's first Zoom program. Bear with us if there are any glitches. I'm Patricia Kranz, the Executive Director of the Overseas Press Club. I am now going to turn it over to Bill Holstein, OPC past president, who's a longtime China hand, and he will take it from here.
Hello, everyone. I see Bill Rookheiser, Rebecca Fannin, Alan Dodd-Frank. Wow, so we have quite a gathering. Jocelyn Ford from the FCCC in Beijing. Wow, so this is great. So obviously, we're coming together in difficult times to try to understand what's happening in our world. And Tiff Roberts spent 23 years in China, an amazing thing. I was able to last 18 months. I was able to last through 2 winters in Beijing before I was driven out and called back to New York. And I found it so difficult, health-wise and every which way. So Tiff survived 23 years. I have enormous respect for you, Tiff, because of the sheer amount of time you spent and the sheer fortitude that you showed and sheer commitment to the story. So Tiff, do you want to start out talking about your book, or do you want to plunge straight into the headlines? How would you like to go?
Well, I'll talk a few minutes about my book, but then we'll spend most of the time on questions because that'll be more interesting for everyone, I'm sure. But I'm happy to, let me just talk for maybe 3 minutes or something.
Fine.
So, well, thank you, first of all, Patty and Bill. This is great. And probably not everyone knows, most people probably don't know that we tried to do this earlier. I think it was scheduled for March 17th in New York. And I was in New York. And if you recall, if everyone recalls what was happening that week, it was just before, it was right before New York shut down and things were becoming increasingly worrisome by the day. So we had to ultimately pull the plug on that. And so now I'm just delighted to have the chance to do this now virtually. So thanks again, Patty and Bill, for making this happen. So I'd like to start, just spend a few minutes, as I said, talking about my book. I'd like to start talking about the origin of my book and how I came about to write it. And to do so, I really have to go back to the year 2000. I'd been in China for about 5 years at that point with Business Week and working with both Patty and Bill at various points, I should point out. We're all former Business Week. And in the year 2000 was the first time that I'd been to Guangdong province before, but it was the first time that I went to Guizhou province, and the first time that in 1 year I visited both those places. And I was working on 2 big cover stories for the magazine for Business Week. And in the first one was, I think it was called The Great Wealth Gap, or the Wealth Gap, China's Wealth Gap, I think it was called. And it was looking at the growing wealth gap in China that had started and grown much more serious under the reforms of Deng Xiaoping after 1978. And at that time, some of you will recall, Jiang Zemin was the president and party secretary, and he had recently launched the Develop the West program, which was an effort to try to end that gap or overcome that gap, Shibu Kaifa in Chinese. So that was the first cover. The second cover, that cover took me to Guizhou. The second cover went to Guangzhou and Guizhou both. And that was for the story, The Great Migration, which was on the migrant workers of China. And looking at those people that were part of that wealth gap, but were at that point, and today still are, leaving rural China and going to the factories and the construction sites in the cities. So those 2 covers I worked on then. And both those covers, at the time, I thought maybe I could get a book out of this someday. I first visited, as I said, to Guizhou. Guangdong and Guizhou are the 2 places that I really focus in on my book. And the first time I met all these migrant workers, particularly a village of migrants from southeastern Guizhou with the surname Mo, who are profiled in my book. So my book, fast forward till today, my book, I would say that the sort of the broad theme is looking at this, what I argue in the book is the biggest economic transition facing China in decades, arguably since Deng Xiaoping. And that's the move from this factory of the world model, where China has relied so much on exporting to the world and relied so much on the cheap wages of the migrant workers, to what they're aiming for, which is a new, much more service-driven economy, and critically, a much more domestic consumption-driven economy. And the argument I make in my book is that this transition, the future of their success in making this transition is really up in the air, and they will not be able to do it unless they overcome the wealth gap, which as I said, I first wrote about back in 2000, and find a way to better integrate migrants and other people, their relatives in rural China, which together is about half of China's population, into the economy. And otherwise, they will not successfully make this transition.
So Tiff, you're arguing that the Chinese have built their economic miracle on the backs of these 600 or 700 million people from the provinces who came into the factories and who may have been hurt, may have been never were accepted in the cities, certainly because of the hukou system. Is that how you call it, hukou? And
That's right.
So that now they're being cast aside as the Chinese move on to a more sophisticated model, so that this population who helped create the economic miracle are now being shunted aside.
Yeah, so I mean, this is one of the arguments that I do make in my book. And just to bring it up to the present, I should mention that nowhere in my book do I mention COVID-19 or the coronavirus. As I said, my book came out on March 10th, right as all of us, at least in the US, were waking up to the severity of the problem that we faced. So that is not part of the book. Having said that, these themes that I look at in the book have only become, I would argue, more critical. So number one, the transition that they need to move away from export-driven economy to the world, that has to happen now. And COVID-19 really brings that home, as did the 2-year trade war before this. It's become very painfully obvious, I argue, to Chinese leaders that they can't rely on the rest of the world for growth anymore. And therefore, they need to really transform to a much more domestic consumption-driven economy. As I mentioned in the book, as you just pointed out, Bill, I look at some of these legacy policies, particularly the hukou, or the household registration policy, but also the dual land policy that makes a distinction between urban and rural land. And I show how those policies are, even today, how, first of all, they're still very strong today, even though they date back originally to the 50s under Mao, and they are holding back full participation of migrants and rural people in the economy.
So let me ask you, one of the big questions when I was in Beijing, and I'm sure it still is legitimacy of the Communist Party. That the Communist Party has a compact with the Chinese people that we will help you develop economically, we'll make you wealthier than you've ever been, and they have, beyond a shadow of a doubt. And China will stand tall in the world, and we will give you pride. This is the Chinese dream that has been promised to these people. So does the COVID-19 in any way challenge the legitimacy of the Communist Party with these group of people that you profiled? Do you think that you feel that there's any risk for the party domestically in how they've responded to this?
Well, I'd point out that, first of all, even before COVID-19, this bargain between the people and the party was really fraying for the migrant workers and the people in rural China. As China has with demographic changes, with higher wages, with automation of the factories, which is a top priority of the Chinese government, there are fewer manufacturing jobs for them. The service jobs that Chinese officials have hoped that they would get are not really, typically are not very high paying or very well skilled. There's, the classic urban job for migrant workers now is motorcycle delivery courier, which is a miserable job, doesn't pay that well, and very dangerous, actually. There's countless accidents every year involving these migrant workers on motorcycles. So I would say that the bargain was already framed in particular for people from the countryside. And I do think that COVID-19 has, unfortunately, the potential to make it fray even more. And so why is that the case? I think we are already seeing, and some of you that are in China can tell us even better, but it does seem as if there's a bit of a sense of normalcy returning to urban China right now. People are starting to go back to work, or they're white collar workers and they're working from home. But this has not been the case at all with the migrant workers and people in rural China. And actually, there's some very interesting research out just last week by the noted scholar Scott Rozelle at Stanford that estimates that just in the first 2 months of the COVID-19 shutdown, migrant workers lost something like $100 billion in wages. And whether or not they'll actually be welcomed back in the cities to the degree that they were before the virus is really, really an open question. And so far, there's signs that they might not be.
So how difficult is it going to be to get the manufacturing platform going again, since it depends so heavily on people who have gone back to the provinces, back to their homes, and may be ill, and travel may be difficult. So how complex is it going to be to resume the Chinese manufacturing engine?
Well, I mean, I think initially it was very difficult. The reports I've seen suggest that actually, in many cases, they have resumed production, at least something close to what it was before, not necessarily at the same levels. Actually, what people are even more worried about now are service sector jobs that migrant workers had. And the challenge with the service side is there's also the demand issue, not just the supply issue of whether the workers can get back there, but the fact that urbanites, may not be ready to go to the restaurants that the migrant workers worked in, or other services that the migrant workers were employed in. So there's a real concern now about, particularly about service industry jobs, and particularly for migrant workers. I should say there's different estimates out about what the unemployment problem is in China right now, but the general growing consensus is it's going to be very, very, it's going to, COVID-19 is going to provide a serious shock to employment, creating huge unemployment in China throughout the year. Even as the economy starts to recover to a degree, they're about ready to get a second shock from the rest of us in the world as the global economy slows down. And they can't expect Americans or other people to be buying many Chinese goods going forward. There's one Chinese economist has estimated that 200 million people are either unemployed or have not been able to return to their jobs. And that's like a quarter of the workforce.
200 million? 200 million?
That's one estimate. Others, I mean, UBS had a different estimate, which was lower, but was also, I can't remember exactly what it was, quite a bit lower, but also quite shocking. To put it in perspective, in the 2008 global financial crisis, I can't remember the exact numbers, maybe 20 million people were out of work, particularly down in the factories in Guangdong. And then the other big wave of layoffs that we've seen in China goes way back to former Premier Zhu Rongji when he reformed the state enterprise sector. At that point, the estimate that was out was 30 million people lost their jobs. And that was seen as a shock. I remember writing about it, and people always compared it and say, well, this is equivalent roughly to the population of France have lost their jobs, and real worries about social instability back then. We're talking about something that will be several factors higher than that this year.
So we're talking a lot about the narrative about what happened, and that the Chinese government is trying to control the narrative and trying to portray themselves as being, having responded forcefully and well, and being heroes to the world. We'll come to more of the international dimension of this, but let's stay focused on the domestic for just one more moment. So the government is trying to demonstrate that it was early in recognizing this, although we know Dr. Lee and others were trying to warn about it, and they were repressed. Local officials were shut down. So, I mean, how dangerous is this for the party's legitimacy and control if a large number of Chinese people begin to believe that the party blew it, the party didn't know what it was doing?
Well, my understanding is that there's sort of three stages to the Chinese official response, and the first one is the serious blunder where they covered it up, and there's research that shows that just delaying by 1 week, meant that 60%, or rather 1 week earlier, dealing with the situation in China could have reduced overall infections by 60%. And I think 3 weeks earlier, something like 90%. So there was a real cost to that initial cover up and blundering part. The second part, was what a lot of the world's paying attention to now, which is this quite impressive effort to, sometimes using draconian means, but the quite impressive effort that really did bring infection rates and deaths way down. And, frankly, what's happening in the US right now is, makes it, we look awful. And it is awful. It's a tragedy here because of our poor response up until now in the US. The third part was this sort of, we're back in business, and gets to the point where, that you just mentioned, the leadership trying to use this sort of to push soft power and create a new narrative, which says, forget about the first part, that never happened. And here, now focus on this, we had this dramatically successful control effort, and now we're back in business. So my understanding is there's a lot of, certainly in the cities, there's a lot of support now for the Communist Party. They look at the second part and they say, wow, the party's wonderful. They look at what's happening in the US and they were like, I'm glad I'm not living in the US, and they're sending masks to their friends here in the US now from China. But whether or not that support will last is an open question, particularly as we see some of the real economic fallout going forward, which I mentioned with what I'm expecting, very high unemployment later this year.
The last question before we shift to an international focus is, we see internationally, we see some signs that the government of China is pushing hard on Hong Kong, pushing hard on South China Sea, pushing hard on certain issues around the world. Are they pushing hard domestically, crossing certain lines in terms of extending their grip on people in ways that they hadn't before? It seems to me that this system they have of having QR codes in people's cell phones, where red, yellow, green, this is creating a measure of control domestically that they've never had. It seems to me that the government might be using this as a way of expanding its control of its population. Do you think that's happening?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it was happening already. This is their long-term goal, is to have a much stronger monitoring system in place for all their citizens. And this is, quite, if you could possibly use the word, fortuitous in the same sentence as COVID-19. This is very fortuitous for the Chinese because, this monitoring is exactly what needs to be done in a crisis like this. So I do think they are using it, and I am worried about how, I do think they're using this as an opportunity to try to beef up all that capability that they already had, and they keep trying to strengthen. And I do worry that we'll see it used in ways a lot less pleasant going forward.
Wow. So let's shift to international dimension. What impact do you think the coronavirus is going to have on China's relations with the world? That's a spectacularly simple question. The answer is endless. But do you detect any signs that the rest of the world is saying to China, you guys did this, and the state of Missouri here sued China? How ridiculous is that? But what is your sense about, will the rest of the world look at this as a reason to be less engaged in China, to be less ready to accept Chinese, quote, leadership in the world? What is your view on that?
Well, if you go back a few weeks, it did appear as if China's effort to use this as to sort of extend its soft power was going very successfully. We've seen this beginnings of real pushback now, certainly in the US, but also, for example, the Australian government recently said, reiterated what the US had been saying, which is we need the Chinese to be transparent. So the Chinese government needs to be transparent so we can get to the bottom of actually how this happened and where it came from. And so I do think that we're seeing these feelings expressed. It's hard to call ultimately what will happen, but I would say that unfortunately, our tremendous lack of success in dealing with COVID-19 is basically handing victory to the Chinese officials. So if they want to make that argument that they have a model that is superior in some ways, certainly dealing with a pandemic, then compared to the U.S., it's a pretty easy argument to make right now.
So tell us all about soft power projection. Chinese, according to my research, have been spending billions of dollars on extending the reach of their media around the world, have been building up their consulates and embassies around the world. They are engaged in a full-scale global battle to establish their narrative, as opposed to any other narratives out there. Would you agree with that, or am I overstating the case?
No, I think you're right. I think that that is happening right now, and we're also seeing different aspects of it. One aspect is much more pugnacious attitude by Chinese diplomats, people like Zhao Lijian, who's now a spokesman at the foreign ministry in China, being directly very critical of the U.S. and also spreading conspiracy theories about how the virus originated. Whether it comes from, whether the U.S. military had a role in it and so on. So these are all things that we did not see before. There was the piece in the New York Times, I think yesterday, that looked at how, whether or not they created some of the false pieces of reporting, they did their best to amplify, they're doing their best to amplify them now. And this is all something that was not true before at all. I mean, certainly wasn't true when I was living in China to this degree, and that wasn't very long ago. So I do think we're seeing this happen. We're seeing what you describe happen, yes.
So in terms of U.S.-Chinese relations, one of the key issues is going to be supply chains. We all have been watching Andrew Cuomo talking about how he can't get the reagents that make the testing kits work, and he can't get the equipment, the PPEs, all these things are becoming accepted as part of the language. Can't get the respirators, can't get this and that. It all comes from China. So, so do you think that the American companies are going to engage in any significant readjustment of their supply chains, or is that going to be too difficult?
I think they will, and I think they already are. And you have to remember that even before COVID-19 came along, we had 2 years of the trade war, and that was a wake-up call for a lot of big American brands, but also other companies from other countries around the world as well. And the fact that their products that produced in China were suddenly being hit with tariffs made the business model much more complicated. And frankly, even before that, we've seen a transition of lower end of companies and factories producing lower end goods moving out of China simply because of wages. And wages now, manufacturing wages in China are higher than in Malaysia, they're higher than in Mexico. So I think we're going to continue to see this happen. I think on the PPE stuff, we're definitely going to see it happen. I think it was a mistake to have so much of it, and antibiotics as well, to have it all in China. So I do expect that to continue to happen. The other thing is, when I first showed up in China long ago, and particularly after China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001, it really was focused as an export platform for most big brands. And that gradually shifted because obviously the other reason to be in China is because of the very potentially and already very large market there. So we're going to continue to have companies, whether it's Intel or Apple or GM, that are in China, not just to manufacture, but also because they're selling, a significant part of their market is right there in China already. And certainly, GM, their largest market. I think Apple, it's been their fastest growing market. Intel, it's extremely important, just those three companies again. So they're not gonna, they may reduce, just one more thing I would say is, there's, even before COVID-19, we've seen Apple telling its suppliers, Foxconn most notably, but others like Wistron and Pegatron, these big Taiwanese companies, that they actually need to diversify. And we've seen them actually going to places like India and Indonesia and other places. So it's going to continue to happen for everybody, but some companies they can't leave forever.
Apple is spectacularly dependent on China for manufacturing of about almost 100% of their iPhones, I believe. So do you believe that they're going to be able to make significant progress in easing their dependence on China as a manufacturing platform?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's easy, but yeah, no, I think it's already happening. I mean, as I said, I mean, this is in my book, so that takes us back a little while, at least a year. So when I sent it to the publishers, but companies, as I said, top Apple suppliers have already been instructed by Apple to look elsewhere, and in some cases, they've successfully set up manufacturing operations in Southeast Asia and India in particular.
What do you think about this argument from Peter Navarro and others that there should be a decoupling of the two economies?
Well, I think it's absurd, and I mean, I think the issue there is, the train has left the station. Big multinationals, the ones I just mentioned, and a bunch of other ones, they're not going to leave China. If they leave China, they're turning their back on their biggest and most important markets, and to ask them to do so means basically to make them much less effective, much less powerful companies globally as well. So I don't think that's going to happen. I do think that a reckoning has come, and more closely looking at our supply chains, and yes, diversifying them outside of China was overdue, actually. And I think companies, I won't name names, but I think they're going to continue to do this. But the idea that, Navarro's idea that we can fully decouple is from an economic perspective, not to mention political, is ridiculous.
Complete lunacy, I agree. It would take 20 or 30 years to do it. We've built these relationships up over 30 years, and so it would take a long time to undo them. So turning to, again, staying on international focus for a moment, the arrest of Martin Lee in Hong Kong, Jimmy Lai, the increased skirmishing in the South China Sea, do you get a sense that the PRC is testing its limits internationally, that they're pushing harder on certain issues internationally that they have been trying to, things they've been trying to achieve for a long time, that they've lost patience. They're pushing harder on these issues than they have before. Do you get that sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not new either. It's something that we saw really under the present leadership in China and under the leadership of Xi Jinping. And the old dung adage about whatever, biding your time,
right?
That's clearly, that's long gone. And so I do think that we're going to continue to see that. I do also think, though, that China is going to be facing really, really significant economic headwinds, the likes of which they haven't seen in many, many years going forward. And so how that affects their push overseas, sort of a soft power or hard power push overseas, is an open question. We'll have to see how that unfolds.
So it's possible that they could have really a series of very tough problems on their hand if they have steep unemployment at home. At the same time, there's some sort of international pushback. Can you imagine or envision a time in which that Xi Jinping could have pushed too hard on his agenda, and that maybe there is a moment of reckoning for him?
I think that what's happening in the economy and the pushback that's happening internationally, as well as you bring up, are challenges to him. And it's no secret to any of us that there are people within China and powerful people that aren't all happy with everything with all of the leadership of Xi Jinping. So that's sort of that's true of any leader in China and true of any leader in the world, frankly. So I do think that that is an issue. On the sort of push overseas, one thing I just note is we don't know if things get harder in China, one possibility is they fan the flames of nationalism, and they do something beyond their borders in the South China Sea or Taiwan, and do that in order to actually try to drum up support from their own people, even as they lose sort of the economic lever to drum up support. And that's a possibility too. So we don't really know how this all unfolds, even as China faces more and more challenges going forward economically.
So do you see any sign of countries, Chinese are on the move around the world, as we know, in astonishing numbers with astonishing amount of money, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, Italy, Greece, Costa Rica, El Salvador, everywhere. Do you see any sign that countries are saying, you know, you guys got us sick and we're not as enthusiastic about your presence here, or you're asserting your interests too aggressively and we're losing enthusiasm for your version of globalization? Do you see any signs of that?
Maybe there were already signs of that before this latest chapter that we're dealing with COVID-19. So yeah, there's signs of that. The open question is the degree to which they can use the present crisis that the world's facing to whether they can use it to actually build up their status overseas or not. And as I said earlier, they have a foil in the failures of the U.S. government dealing with COVID-19, unfortunately, which makes it much easier for them to present themselves as a good model to the world. And they've been doing that obviously with exports of PPE and to different countries around the world. There's been pushback, but nevertheless, they'll continue to do it. It would be interesting to see what happens.
Need China for dams and bridges, and I mean they're the people you can go to and get dams, bridges, ports, all that. So and now they're the people to go to get the PPEs and the other equipment you need. Talk about U.S.-Chinese relations. We've had a so-called Donald Trump's trade war, tariffs, a lot of bombast, sparring in the South China Sea. What do you think that this will exacerbate U.S.-Chinese conflict, or will it result in some denouement where they both recognize that they have common interests? I see the Chinese ambassador Cui saying that it's time to have a fundamental review of the relationship. Where do you see it going?
Well, first on the trade war, I think that it's far from resolved. And the phase one agreement that we saw earlier really was sort of just a doorstopper. The Chinese side promised to make big acquisitions, big purchases, mainly of agricultural goods, and the difficult stuff, dealing with issues like coercive technology transfer requirements when you do business in China, subsidies, both direct and implicit, and uneven implementation of policies for foreign companies versus Chinese companies. All those things are still very much alive, and that was supposed to be saved for a second phase agreement. I don't anticipate a second phase agreement coming anytime soon at all. And I should say, interestingly, what the US government says that it wants solved with the second phase agreement, and I understand why, because I think in many cases there are unfair trading and investment practices by China, are interestingly the same things that I was hearing about when I first showed up in China in the mid-90s and started writing about the US-China trade and investment relationship. So whether it was poor protection of intellectual property rights, or it was coercive technology transfer requirements, and so on. That's what I was writing about in the mid-90s, in the late 90s, and kept writing about it right up until I left. And the reason why it's still there is because I think that those policies actually are very important to the Chinese idea, this ideal of trying to transform the economy to a much more globally strong global technology power. And so it makes me very pessimistic that we're actually going to come to any agreement.
I would agree with
China wants to continue to use those policies for its own interests. And it's pretty understandable.
I would agree with you that the Made in China 2025 and the various technology platforms that they are trying to achieve and conquer the various technologies, that to say to them, we don't want you to support your state-owned enterprises in their pursuit of these technologies is a non-starter. I mean, it's like the British with their warships in 1840 and the Opium Wars, that this is clearly an attempt by outside powers to force them to give up something that's really very important to them. So I would agree that that's highly unlikely. So
when we didn't hear about Made in China 2025, it wasn't because they abandoned that as a policy. And by the way, before Made in China 2025, we had indigenous innovation, right, which we wrote a lot about at Business Week. And these goals of trying to use what the U.S. administration has been arguing are sort of state planning, unfair trading practices are, they're very integral, and they have been for a very long time, to sort of this Chinese model of economic development. So yeah, I don't think that's going away. On the other side, the U.S., I mean, ultimately, I see the sort of the competition as one between sort of an aging superpower, which is the U.S., which has no desire to see, someone else come on the scene and start to chip away at the power that the U.S. has had for these years. And you have the Chinese, on China's side, quite naturally, a rising superpower, which obviously wants to see itself play a much larger role globally. And I don't think ultimately that conflict can be resolved anytime soon at all, if ever.
Reminds me of the Americans negotiating the Structural Impediments Initiative with Japan in the 1980s, that there were structural impediments that the Americans thought they could get the Japanese to resolve. But of course, those very structure of the Japanese economy was giving them economic momentum, and they weren't in the slightest bit interested in resolving those structural impediments.
Excuse me for interrupting, Bill. There's only 20 minutes left.
Okay.
I think it's about time to start taking questions.
We have many waiting. Okay, let's go.
Good point.
So I think the way we were going to do it is for people to submit their questions by chat. If you hit the chat button, and then we can take it in order, and we'll unmute the person whose turn it is. So Chad, I turn it over to you for that.
We have Dory Jones Yang, Tom and Leah Spiro, Ian Williams, Alan Frank. We've got some very distinguished people in the room.
I see some friends as well. So it's great to see the people that some of those names are old friends.
So just let us know in that chat space if you can't find it. It looks like a little talk bubble labeled chat at the bottom of your screen, maybe, and just throw a word in there to say that you have a question.
And then we'll unmute you in the audience. We'll unmute you. Jamie Fleur Cruz. Wow. Wow. Jocelyn
Yes,
Ford.
Great. Okay, so Dory Young, we have a question from you. I'll go ahead and unmute so you can ask that question.
Okay. Hi, Tiff. Hi, everybody from Seattle. My question is about the migrants that you write about so eloquently, and what you would expect the effect of the lockdown and the COVID-19 crisis would be on the migrants.
Yeah, well, good question. Thank you, Dory. I'm sadly quite worried about what's going to happen, and so far the early signs are not positive at all. So as I mentioned earlier, we have some very interesting research right off the bat, the first 2 months of the COVID-19 lockdowns in China from Stanford, which shows that something like up to $100 billion in migrant wages have already been lost. And that research also looks, asks questions like how many of people have actually been able to return to their jobs, and in many cases, it's a very small number. It also looks at health issues. On the positive side, there were lockdowns, of course, in villages across China where these migrants come from, and of course they were back for the Lunar New Year, so they were not in the cities or at their place of employment usually when this happened, and so the lockdowns that happened in the villages as well, according to this survey, suggest that they were effective in controlling COVID-19 infections, which is very good news. But at the same time, they've been devastating for the incomes of these migrant workers, not just returning to the cities, but also off-farm work, typically in the local township, whether it's driving a little truck or whatever it is. Those opportunities have also apparently completely dried up. It's had an impact. There's other interesting things. It's had an impact on children's school, migrant children's school, of course. It's also had an impact on getting access to healthcare that's not COVID-19 related, not surprisingly. So going forward, I'm concerned in part because the opportunities for migrant workers in certain cities, certainly in the big showcase cities like Beijing and Shanghai, had already been diminishing. And the attitudes, again, in the big showcase cities, including many provincial capitals towards the migrants, was not very positive. Many cases like Beijing and Shanghai, they actually have set population targets which are reduced, and they are actively trying to make the migrants leave, doing things like shutting down the small private schools that have catered to migrant children in the cities when the children have come with their parents. With COVID-19 and fears of outsiders, I'm concerned that this trend, which is sort of this anti-migrant trend that you see in many bigger cities, is only going to become stronger.
Next question.
All right, next question comes from Ian Williams. And Ian, you are ready to, let's see, hang on. There you go, you should be unmuted now.
Right. This is where, to some extent, this is where Bill and I came in. We had an OPC trip to Guangzhou and Hong Kong back in the early 90s when the transition was taking place. And we met the party official who was basically conducting what was an experiment there. And I remember at the time when we discussed it, that seemed to be the flaw, that they were working on how to decant the iron rice bowl down. And at the end of it were the migrant workers. And I remember we asked the official, well, when it comes to the migrant workers and you think they're superfluous, what do you do? Oh, they'll just go home, he said. And you know, it struck me as an immediate flaw. And the fact that it survived as a model as long as it has is quite surprising. But, you know, being cynical about it, since Deng Xiaoping did away with the people's communes and the local political structures out in the rural areas, could they get away with decanting all of these migrant workers out to the countryside? Is there any potential for a political focus for these people to mount political pressure on Beijing and the central authorities to take notice and to look after them the way that you know, officially the Peasants' Alliance was supposed to?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. You that was what you heard back then. I mean, the point as well, I mean, one of the major goals of the Develop the West policy, which came out in maybe '99, was exactly that, to build up economic development in the countryside and also opportunities, with the assumption that eventually all these migrants could go back there. And so I think you're right. And recent years, if anything, despite talk of hukou reform, which I think has been piecemeal and basically pretty unimportant ultimately to the lives of most migrant workers, you know, they've actually moved even further in that direction. It's almost as if they're saying, okay, you know, factory of the world model, we're done with that. You guys aren't particularly cheap anymore. Manufacturing's decamping to Southeast Asia. And by the way, we have a big goal in Made in China 2025 to automate our factories. So time to go home. So, I mean, one of the things I look at in the book is how successfully these people can reinvent themselves as they do go back to the countryside. And by the way, we've seen large numbers of them, tens of millions already returning to places like Guizhou that I write about. And, you know, there's positive stories. They go back, they become small entrepreneurs. In Guizhou, a focus is on tourism, because Guizhou is a beautiful place with a few little manufacturing, so there's not much pollution. It's got good food. So in some cases they'll go back and they can succeed. But I don't think that it's very easy at all. One of the things I heard again and again from migrant workers as I interviewed them over the last few years, when I started to look at this phenomena of returnees, was it's not easy. And they all had stories about friends who had gone back and started a little business and gone bankrupt. And keep in mind that in many cases, they're absolute strangers in their own villages because they've just spent the last 20 years of their life living in places like Dongguan. And they're quite sophisticated. They don't even necessarily, you know, they speak funny. I heard that again and again. We go back and the villagers who are still there laugh at us. And, you know, it's not a benefit. We don't go back and we're not well connected. And it isn't easy to go back and become a business person.
Chad, can we recognize Jamie Florcruz? Jamie was in Beijing when I was there, going back to 1981, 82. So Jamie has a 40 years involvement with China. I'd like to ask you, what do you think about, and briefly, what do you think about what we've been saying tonight? And might you have a question for Tiff?
Yeah, well, I've been away from the field since November. I'm stranded in Manila this past several months, so I'm kind of out of touch, as you know. China remains a very complex place to figure out. My question for Tiff is, what is driving the recent expulsion of U.S. reporters? Is it just anti-Americans? What about the other reporters who are doing just as tough, asking questions and writing tough reports? What does this bode for coverage of China if more and more reporters are driven out?
Okay, well, good question, and great to see you, Jamie, virtually.
Congratulations.
Last time was in Beijing. So the proximate cause, of course, and what the Chinese officials will say was their motivation was the U.S. Limits on, basically declaring, what was it, Xinhua, China Daily, People's Daily, maybe one other, as state agents, and limiting the number of Chinese journalists that could be in the U.S. So that happened first. But I do think that China didn't have to respond in this way. I think it's a very dramatic gesture, as you know better than me. They've never done that before. They've even rarely kicked people out. Usually they would wait till your visa has to be renewed, right? And then just say, oh, we can't renew your visa. So, but they have expelled some people, obviously, and including maybe at least one person on this. But in any case, I think it's a very, very alarming sort of step up in the tensions and the problems between the two countries. As some other people pointed out, it's sort of one step below expelling diplomats. The Chinese certainly see, unfortunately for us, when we were there, often see us as sort of quasi-state actors and treat us in that way. So I think to actually choose those three media organizations, of which I have many friends who are affected by this, who were doing, remarkably good coverage, including, of course, of COVID-19. I think it's a big gesture, and it's sort of a shot back to say, bring it on. We're ready to make this relationship much, you do one thing, we're ready to react much more strongly. And I think it has it's part and parcel of what we were discussing earlier about this entirely new wolf warrior attitude with the diplomats and so on, which is not something that you can tell me if you disagree, Jamie, but I never saw it to this, anything like this in my years there. You were there long enough, maybe you've seen something like this before.
No, this is new. This is all brand new in terms of the wolf warriors. Do you think, Tiff, that the expulsion of these journalists can be connected to the coronavirus? That Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal are precisely the organizations that have the best trained people, the biggest budgets, the longest depths of experience, the biggest platforms, that if you get rid of them, then the chances for the real truth of what's happening with the coronavirus in China, the chances that gets out are diminished. Do you think that there could have been, a dual strategy? Yes, we want to retaliate against the Trump administration, but secondly, we want to diminish the ability of the American media to get to the bottom of what's going on.
Yeah, I think without question, it's a blow to informed, coverage from China right now, to get rid of those three organizations who've had such skilled reporters there in China. So I think in part they do that. It's also sort of a warning signal to other journalists who hopefully don't react by, I don't think in most cases, the foreign journalists I knew certainly wouldn't self-censorship in response, but that is a warning. We're willing to not just throw out individual journalists, we'll throw out whole media organizations. I also think, sadly, it can be sort of unifying for at least urban Chinese. First of all, as I said, the U.S. took the first step here. China responds in this way. I think a lot of people in Chinese cities say, yeah, at least when when infections have come down and COVID-19 looks under control, they'll say, yeah, those foreign reporters are not friendly to our country. They're out there to undermine our rise. And these are sort of narratives that the Chinese leadership is constantly putting out, including in their media. And unfortunately, I think they're often picked up by urban Chinese. I have friends and relatives in China, and there's a pretty real anti-foreign sort of wave or sentiment now in many parts of China. And I would say that foreign journalists are probably right at the height of it. I mean, it's very easy to sort of label them as unfriendly to China.
Is Jocelyn Ford still on the call, Chad?
Yes, in fact, Jocelyn's question is next up in the queue.
All
If we can just,
Jocelyn,
Hey,
you are now
hi,
unmuted.
Tiff,
Hi, Jocelyn.
great to see you again.
Yes.
I have a quick question about the standards for up and coming technologies, biotech, artificial intelligence, et cetera. How do you see the competition playing out as China's trying to set standards globally?
Well, first of all, I'll give my quick answer, and then maybe Bill's done a whole book on this. But standards have always been part of the competition. And as I mentioned earlier, with indigenous innovation, which was under Hu Jintao, so going back a while, a big part of their plans for indigenous innovations was for indigenous innovation, which basically meant promoting Chinese products around the world, was also using Chinese created standards. And this was a real big deal for foreign companies operating in China, already however many years ago, 10 plus years ago, because it meant that they would, they some cases have to rework their products according to the new Chinese standards in order to actually do business in China. But China's goal didn't stop at the borders of China. They want these standards, obviously, to become a global part of the standard setting regime. So anyway, Bill, Bill might actually, I think Bill actually could add a lot more to this.
well, I'm watching the Huawei and 5G situation. Obviously, the Chinese company Huawei is trying to establish a global footprint with 5G communications, and that means standards, and that means persuading governments, including Germany, Britain, Australia, Canada, to embrace their technology. So there's a global battle underway, and in this case, it has really deep consequences in terms of control of telecommunications networks. So if the Huawei software and hardware is involved in Germany and Britain and Canada and Australia, they are going to have a window into the telecommunications infrastructure that we have, that the Chinese telecommunications and communications knowledge base has just exploded in the last 5 years. So they're absolutely world-class now, and maybe more sophisticated than we are in some respects, because they've developed a large cadre of engineers and other mid-level people who really know what they're doing. So, yes, we're engaged in a global technological battle for dominance, and in many sectors, autonomous driving, many sectors. Who is going to control the technological future? Jocelyn, where are you now? Are you back in China, or are you still in Massachusetts? What is the Foreign Correspondents Club of Beijing, FCCC, what are they saying about what's going on with the Western correspondents?
This is unprecedented times in terms of the pressure, and that's about where I'll leave it right now.
All right, pleasure. I guess we can go to the next question then.
Okay, the next question comes from Yingyi Ma. And let me just find you. Here we go. You are ready to go there.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate you bring attention to rural migrant worker, and I agree that the damage of COVID-19 on them is especially harsh. But my question is about this rural-urban divide in terms of the consequences. And there is an urban, as you pointed out, there is a very strong support among the city residents behind the Chinese government right now. And whether this legitimacy, I want to circle back to the question of the support and legitimacy, whether rural people and their sufferings can influence the current narrative of Chinese government victory or competence in the strong leadership here. I'm actually concerned whether they have any voice here, because obviously urban people and people who are intellectuals and elites, they're actually controlling the narrative.
I think that when we've seen sort of a upswelling of urban concern or support for migrant worker concerns, has been related to to tragedies. So we saw it way back, I think in 2003, if I recall correctly, with the death of this migrant named Sun Zhigang in one of the what they called the black jails then, where they would pick up migrants and throw them in there if they didn't have proper documentation in the cities. At that point, there was it became a national issue, and people like Xu Zhiyong, now the rights lawyer, who's now I believe back in jail, started to focus on and people like Teng Biao, who's I believe in New York, started to focus on migrant worker concerns, and it actually became a national issue. A few years ago with the left behind children, the children of migrant workers who typically are left behind because they can't get into city schools and grow up apart from their parents, except for maybe seeing them once a year at the Lunar New Year. That also became a very big issue. Particularly, there were some deaths in Guizhou of migrant kids that had been left behind that were, in one case, sleeping in a dumpster and asphyxiated because they started a fire there. That became a national issue. But I do think that generally, other than these moments when some tragedy happens, I'm afraid that the urban attitude towards the migrants, I don't think is very, very favorable. And you'll see, I mean, an example I mentioned in the book and just was really hit home for me was a number of years ago when the Chinese government decided they wanted to bring more migrant worker children into urban schools, basically do the right thing. What happened? There were protests by urban families, urban parents who did have the hukou to live in the cities, who had no desire to see more competition in the schools from migrant kids. So I guess I'm not too optimistic about this becoming an issue, a place where you see urban support for the migrants.
I think we're down to the last question. Can I recognize Bill Rookheiser, the editor of Fortune and Money magazine and on the board of the OPC Foundation? Can we get him to ask us the final question?
It's a really good discussion. Thanks, Tiff, and everybody concerned. Tiff, to what extent do you think the current tensions between the US and China would be affected one way or the other if Trump isn't reelected this year?
Yeah, I don't think the tensions will go away, and we're seeing already, obviously, that China is becoming an issue in the election, and Biden did that advertisement that some people, spoke out against. They felt it was racist. Other people, wouldn't necessarily agree. But the point is, I think China's become a real issue. It's going to be right up in the election, and I think that these, as I said earlier, the concerns, for example, in the trade relationship, I just don't see them going away. Things could potentially get a little bit better for a while, but I'm quite pessimistic when I look, further into the future on the relationship, which makes me very sad. I've spent more of my life in China than anywhere else, actually, and very an important part of my life. So I wish it were not so.
Tiff, any final word or two about how you see your book fitting into the great debate about China, or what do you think? What are your observations about what happens next? Give us the final parting shot.
Well, I would just say what I started to say at the beginning, which is, although my book doesn't deal with COVID-19 and the sort of unprecedented changes we're seeing in the world right now, I think it's actually become even more topical because, as I said earlier, that one of my major themes is looking at China, this necessary transition from being more focused on exports to becoming a much more domestic consumption driven economy. And I don't think that China's can do that, as I said earlier, without finding out how to better integrate this other half of the Chinese population into the economy. And the signs are that they're moving in the opposite direction now. I also think that, as I said earlier, things like COVID-19 sort of have the potential to really intensify the conflicts and bring to the fore some of the issues between the U.S. and China, particularly as both economies do badly. And so anyway, I'll just stop there.
As the Chinese proverb says, may you live in interesting times, and we certainly do. So thank you, Tiff and Patty and Chad for your support, technological and organizational support. And I think it's been a very stimulating conversation. I've learned something, and I hope everyone else has benefited. So with no further ado, thank you and good night.
Well, and we're sorry for the people who didn't get their to ask their questions. You can email them to me and I'll email them to Tiff. Okay.
Yeah, please do. I'd love to see them. Thanks for the great questions that were put in.
Good night, all.
Okay. Thank you. Good night.